Natalie had spent years building what looked, from the outside, like a calm and respectable life. A steady marriage. A beautiful home. A best friend she trusted like family. The kind of life people nodded at approvingly when they heard about it, the kind that made others think she had finally found her place in the world. And for the most part, she believed it too. Not because it was perfect, but because she had learned how to hold a marriage together with patience, how to overlook long work hours, and how to convince herself that every relationship had quiet seasons. That was why the business trip felt so ordinary when it began. Just a few days away, a hotel room, conference calls, and long stretches of time she would rather have spent at home. Still, she made a decision that felt small at the time but would end up changing everything. She'd come back early. She wanted to surprise Ethan. Maybe bring home dinner, maybe laugh about his reaction, maybe enjoy one of those rare moments when life felt playful and warm again. She even stopped by a bakery on the way from the airport, smiling to herself as she imagined his face when he saw her standing in the doorway. But the moment she pulled into the driveway, something in her chest tightened. There were too many cars. Too much noise. Balloons. Soft music drifting through open windows. A strange mix of laughter and chatter that didn't belong to a normal Thursday afternoon. For a second, she told herself it must be some neighborhood gathering, something harmless. Yet as she walked closer, her keys trembling in her hand, she felt the first quiet warning that something was very wrong. Inside, the house was full of people she knew. Friends. Co-workers. Neighbors. And standing in the middle of it all, glowing in a way Natalie had never seen before, was Sophie. Her best friend. For a moment, Natalie couldn't make sense of the scene. The decorations. The gifts. The table covered in pink and blue ribbons. And then her eyes landed on Sophie's rounded belly, and the room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Ethan turned toward the doorway at the sound of her voice, and the expression on his face said everything before anyone even spoke. Surprise. Panic. Then something colder. Something practiced. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. No one moved. No one rushed to explain. The silence was somehow worse than shouting. And then, with the kind of calm that only comes after too many lies, Ethan said her name as if she were the one interrupting something important. If you think you know where this is going, stay with me, because what Natalie discovered in the next few minutes would uncover years of red flags she should never have been asked to ignore. Natalie stood in the doorway for a second that felt too long to survive, her suitcase still in her hand, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. The apartment looked almost festive. Soft music played in the background, there were pastel decorations on the table, and people she knew from Ethan's side of the family turned toward her with frozen smiles that didn't belong in a happy room. Then she saw the banner. Then she saw Sophie. Her best friend stood near the couch with one hand resting carefully over her stomach, glowing in a way Natalie had once mistaken for exhaustion or stress. Now every detail rearranged itself into something cruel. Ethan was beside her, pale and rigid, like a man caught in a light he had prayed would never turn on. For a moment no one spoke. The silence itself felt like an accusation. Natalie's voice came out small, almost polite. "What is this?" Ethan opened his mouth, but Sophie answered first, her tone trembling with practiced softness. "We were going to tell you. We just didn't want to hurt you." The words landed with a bitter kind of irony. Natalie looked from Sophie to Ethan, searching their faces for the kind of confusion that would prove this was a mistake. Instead she found guilt, fear, and something worse, preparation. This wasn't a surprise. It was a performance, and she had walked in at the wrong time. She remembered the little things now, the late calls, the sudden work trips, the excuses that sounded almost reasonable if you didn't stare at them too long. Ethan saying he was too stressed to talk. Sophie canceling lunches because she was dealing with personal stuff. Her own instincts had nudged her, quietly, more than once. She had dismissed them the way decent people do when they trust the wrong ones. One of the women at the table reached for Natalie's arm, but Natalie stepped back. She could feel every eye in the room, every judgment, every unspoken question. How long has she known? How could she not see? Why is she just now finding out? Those questions were already forming in the air, even before anyone said them. Ethan finally spoke, his voice breaking. Natalie, please. It's not what it looks like. That old line. The one people use when they know the truth would destroy them faster than silence. Natalie almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the human mind can only absorb so much betrayal before it starts protecting itself with disbelief. She set the suitcase down slowly. Her hands were steady, even if the rest of her wasn't. And in that strange, suspended moment, something inside her shifted. The shock was still there, the hurt still sharp, but beneath it was the first hard edge of clarity. She wasn't looking at an accident. She was looking at a pattern. And as the room waited for her to collapse, Natalie took one long breath and realized this was only the beginning. The silence in that house was the first thing Natalie noticed after she stepped inside. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the heavy, careful kind that settles over a room when too many people have agreed to pretend. She could still hear the faint echo of laughter from the backyard, muffled by the closed patio door, and for one hopeful second she thought she had walked into some innocent surprise meant for someone else. Then she saw the balloons. The pastel ribbons. The cake on the table. The little stack of gift bags arranged with deliberate sweetness. And then she saw Sophie. Her best friend stood near the center of it all, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, smiling like she had every right to be there. Ethan was beside her, close enough that there was no mistaking the intimacy between them. He looked up first, and whatever expression had been on his face drained away so quickly it was almost comic, if Natalie's heart hadn't already begun to pound so hard she felt sick. Natalie, he said, too fast. You're home early. There was no joy in his voice. No surprise either. Just panic. Natalie stared at the room, then back at the two people she had trusted most in the world. What is this? She asked, her own voice sounding far calmer than she felt. Sophie's smile flickered, but only for a second. We were going to tell you. Natalie gave a tiny, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes when your mind refuses to accept what your eyes already know. Tell me what? That my husband and my best friend are throwing a baby shower together in my house? No one answered. That was answer enough. The people in the backyard had started to drift toward the doorway, sensing the tension the way animals sense weather. Natalie recognized neighbors, cousins, a few old friends. Faces that had smiled at her for years, faces that had looked her in the eye and hidden this from her. The betrayal widened with each familiar expression. And suddenly, all the moments she had dismissed came rushing back with terrible clarity. Ethan's late nights. Sophie's endless visits when Natalie was traveling. The way conversations would stop whenever she entered a room. The little excuses, the too perfect alibis, the warm reassurances that had once felt comforting and now felt poisonous. She looked at Sophie. How long? Sophie's mouth opened, then closed again. Ethan answered instead, his voice low and strained. Natalie, please, let's talk somewhere private. That was when Natalie understood the full shape of it. The secrecy. The coordination. The years of it. This wasn't a mistake that had spiraled out of control. It was a life carefully built behind her back. And still, even in that moment, some quieter part of her remained standing. Hurt, yes. Humiliated, absolutely. But not broken. Not yet. Because sometimes the first red flag isn't the affair. Sometimes it's the lie that teaches everyone else to stay silent. Natalie took one slow breath and lifted her chin. If they thought she was going to fall apart in front of them, they had underestimated her. And if you've ever ignored a warning sign because love made you generous, then you already know how dangerous that kind of silence can be. But Natalie was done being silent now. She looked from Ethan to Sophie, then toward the people gathered around them, and asked the one question that would change everything. So who knew first? The room had gone so quiet that Natalie could hear the faint tick of the wall clock behind her, each second landing like a strike to the chest. Ethan was still standing there with that stunned, guilty look men wore when the truth had finally outrun them. Sophie had one hand over her mouth, her eyes already glistening, but Natalie noticed something else beneath the tears: fear. Not sorrow. Fear of being seen. No one moved at first. The pastel decorations, the tiny shoes arranged on the table, the gift bags lined up like evidence, all of it seemed absurd now, like a cheerful stage set built over a grave. Natalie slowly looked from one face to another, taking in the guests she had trusted for years. Some stared at the floor. Some looked away too quickly. A few had the kind of expression people wear when they hope silence will make them less guilty. It didn't. Sophie took a shaky step forward. "Natalie, please," she said, her voice thin and pleading. "We were going to tell you." Natalie let out a small, humorless laugh. "When?" she asked. "After the baby was born? After you had all decided I was too inconvenient to deserve the truth?" Ethan flinched, but he said nothing. And that silence, more than the affair itself, was what finally hardened something in Natalie's heart. She had spent years believing distance, overwork, and little excuses meant life was simply busy. Now those memories rearranged themselves with brutal clarity. The missed calls. The unexplained trips. The late nights. The sudden tenderness he showed only when he needed her distracted. Every red flag had been there, waving in plain sight, and she had trusted love to explain them away. One of the older women at the table finally whispered, "Natalie, we didn't want to hurt you." Natalie turned to her, calm in a way that surprised even herself. "Then you should have respected me enough to tell me the truth," she said. "Hiding cruelty doesn't make it kindness." She set her bag down on the nearest chair, not because she intended to stay, but because she wanted her hands free. Her pulse was still racing, yet beneath the shock there was something steadier beginning to rise. Not forgiveness. Not even understanding. Just clarity. The kind that comes when a person sees their life exactly as it is and stops begging it to be different. Sophie began crying harder now, insisting this had just happened, that feelings had gotten complicated, that no one meant for it to go this far. But Natalie heard what was missing from every word: accountability. No one had stumbled into a lie this large by accident. It had been built, protected, and repeated until it became a whole second life. And as Natalie stood there in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a surprise homecoming, she understood something that would carry her through the days ahead. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the moment she stopped living inside theirs. If you've ever ignored a red flag because the truth felt too heavy to carry, you already know how dangerous silence can be. And in Natalie's case, that silence was about to break open in ways none of them were ready for. For a long moment, Natalie couldn't even feel the floor beneath her feet. The voices inside the house blurred into one meaningless hum, and all she could hear was the brutal, steady thud of her own heartbeat. Then she saw it again, the little pastel decorations, the folded gift bags, the table set with tiny cupcakes and a cake that had already been cut. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a celebration. A private, deliberate celebration of the life Ethan had built with Sophie while she was away trying to keep her own life together. Sophie stood there with one hand resting on her stomach, looking terrified and triumphant at the same time. Ethan's face had gone pale, but not enough to erase the guilt written all over it. Natalie looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing a stranger wearing her husband's face. "How long?" she asked, and her voice was so calm it startled even her. No one answered right away. That silence told her more than any confession could have. Finally, Ethan swallowed hard and tried to step closer. "Natalie, please, let me explain." But there are some moments when explanation is just another word for delay. Another way to keep the truth from landing all at once. She lifted a hand and stopped him there. She didn't want his excuses, his carefully polished lies, or the version of events he had probably rehearsed 100 times. She wanted the truth, plain and ugly. And in that room, surrounded by people who had smiled in her face while hiding this from her, the truth was impossible to soften. Her best friend broke first. Sophie's eyes filled, and she started crying before she could even form a sentence. "We didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said. Natalie almost laughed at that. People always say that when they've spent months, maybe years, making sure something terrible happens exactly the way it did. Nothing about betrayal is accidental once the lies begin to pile up. Natalie turned slowly, taking in the room, the guests, the faces she trusted, and the stunned expression of the one woman she had once called sister. In that moment, the red flags she had ignored came rushing back with painful clarity. The late-night texts Ethan had brushed off, Sophie's strange distance, the vacations that never quite lined up, the whispered conversations cut short when Natalie walked into the room. All those little warnings she had tried to explain away now formed one devastating picture. And yet, even then, something inside Natalie did not break completely. It straightened. It steadied. Maybe that's what happens when the truth finally arrives too late to be denied. You stop pleading with it. You start standing beside it. She took one slow breath and said, "This isn't my shame to carry." The room went silent. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better. Natalie had already begun the long, difficult step from shock into power, and there was no going back now. Natalie stood there long enough for the room to blur around the edges, long enough for the cheerful chatter to turn into a muffled hum that seemed to come from underwater. Nobody moved at first. Nobody knew how to explain why her husband was standing beside her best friend, one hand resting protectively over the curve of Sophie's stomach, while a banner that read "Welcome Baby" hung crookedly over the fireplace. It was the kind of scene that should have belonged to someone else's nightmare, not to her life. Then the silence broke into nervous voices. "Natalie," Ethan said, his face draining of color. "You weren't supposed to be back yet." Not supposed to be back yet. As if her own home had become a place she needed permission to enter. Sophie's hand trembled as she stepped forward, but Natalie noticed how quickly she reached for Ethan's sleeve before she did anything else. It was such a small movement, almost invisible to everyone else. But to Natalie, it said everything. That instinctive reach, that practiced closeness, that terrible ease between them, it was the final red flag made visible. Someone from the kitchen whispered her name. Another person stared down at their drink. These were people Natalie had shared holidays with, laughed with, trusted with pieces of her life. And they had all known. For how long, she wondered. Months? Years? Had they watched her leave for work, smile over dinner, talk about future plans, and say nothing while her husband and best friend built an entire secret family in the shadows? Her voice came out quieter than she expected. How long? No one answered immediately. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but Natalie no longer trusted tears. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "It's not what you think." That was the oldest lie in the book, and tonight it landed with the weight of a stone. Natalie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man she had built a life with, but someone who had carefully trained her to accept excuses. The late nights. The missed calls. The sudden work stress. The phone face down on the table. The way Sophie had started acting just a little too thoughtful, a little too busy, a little too unavailable. Every tiny warning had been there, and she had brushed them aside because trust, once given, is hard to question. But now the truth was standing in front of her in matching smiles and shared secrets. She took one slow breath, then another. Not because she was calm, but because she refused to break where they could see it. "You can explain," she said, her voice steadying, "but not in front of me. Not here." and for the first time that night, Ethan looked afraid. This was not the collapse he had prepared for. This was something stronger. Natalie turned toward the door, heart pounding, eyes burning, and every person in that room watched her leave in stunned silence. But as she reached the hallway, one thought rose above the pain: if they had been lying this long, what else had they been hiding? Natalie stood in that living room like the floor had quietly disappeared beneath her. The balloons, the pastel decorations, the tiny wrapped gifts laid out on the table, all of it suddenly looked obscene. Ethan had gone pale, Sophie was crying in that sharp, performative way that sounded more like damage control than remorse, and the room full of people who were supposed to love Natalie had gone silent. No one met her eyes for more than a second. That silence told her everything she needed to know. She heard Ethan saying her name, trying to soften the moment with the same tone he used when he wanted her to stop asking questions. "Natalie, please, let me explain." But there was no explanation large enough to make sense of years of lies. Her best friend was pregnant with her husband's child, and both of them had stood inside her life like trusted guests while building a secret family behind her back. The cruelty of it was almost too much to hold in one body. And yet, even in that moment, Natalie did something powerful. She did not scream. She did not throw the cake. She did not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart the way they expected. She simply looked around the room one more time, taking in every face, every lowered gaze, every person who had chosen comfort over honesty. Then she said, quietly, "How long?" The question landed heavier than any accusation could have. When Ethan hesitated, she knew the answer was worse than she had feared. Sophie answered instead, her voice trembling. "It started after your last promotion." That detail hit Natalie like a second betrayal. While she was working late, traveling for business, building the life they all claimed to admire, they had been rewriting her marriage into a lie. The red flags she had explained away suddenly lined up with brutal clarity: the unexplained distance, the sudden secrecy, the way Sophie had begun canceling plans at the last minute, the way Ethan had become defensive over nothing. She had been living inside a warning sign for years. Natalie took off her wedding ring and placed it on the entry table, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a boundary. "You should have told me before I had to find out here," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Then she turned and walked out into the cool night air, breathing like someone learning how to survive again. That first step away from them did not heal her, but it changed her. Because once the shock began to settle, something stronger took its place: clarity. And clarity has a way of opening doors people thought were locked forever. The question was no longer whether Natalie could survive this. The real question was what kind of life she would build next, now that the truth was finally in the light. Natalie stood very still after the room fell silent, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little control she had left. The balloons bobbed softly above the gift table. The cake sat there with its pale blue frosting and neat little letters. Everyone looked at her now, not with celebration anymore, but with the stunned discomfort people wear when they realize they have been standing inside someone else's disaster. Sophie's hand was still resting on her stomach. Ethan had gone pale. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again, like even his lies had finally abandoned him. Natalie looked from one face to another, and in that awful, crystal-clear moment, the memory of every strange excuse came rushing back. The late nights. The sudden business trips. The whispered calls in the hallway. The way Sophie had smiled too often and too easily whenever Ethan was mentioned. All those small red flags had once seemed harmless, even laughable. Now they looked like pieces of a puzzle she had been too trusting to assemble. "For years," she said quietly, and the sound of her own voice surprised her. "You've been doing this for 4 years." No one answered. Her mother-in-law started crying first, which was almost insulting in its own way. Then someone muttered something about how complicated it all was, as if complexity could soften cruelty. Natalie nearly laughed. Complicated was a missed train. Complicated was a hard conversation. This was deliberate. This was a campaign of deception built in the shadow of her marriage and dressed up in family concern. Ethan took a step toward her. "Natalie, please, let me explain." She held up one hand, and he stopped. "No," she said. "You don't get to explain your way out of years of lies. You don't get to call this a mistake and expect me to carry the shame for it." There was a steadiness in her tone that even she had not expected. It came from somewhere deeper than anger, deeper than heartbreak. It came from the part of her that still knew her own worth. She turned to Sophie, who looked as if she might collapse under the weight of her own guilt. Natalie felt no satisfaction in seeing that. Only a cold, clean sadness. "You were my best friend," Natalie said. "And you watched me build a life around you both." Sophie began to cry, but Natalie had no interest in tears that arrived too late to matter. The room remained frozen as Natalie took off her ring and placed it carefully on the table beside the cake. Not thrown. Not hurled. Just set down, like something finished. That simple act seemed to change the air around her. Outside, the evening had deepened into a soft, silver-blue dusk. Natalie stepped toward the door, and no one stopped her. Maybe they knew they had already done enough. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed again and again with messages she refused to open. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, breathing through the ache in her chest, letting the truth settle into place. She had lost a marriage, a friendship, and the story she thought her life was telling. But she had not lost herself. And that, more than anything, was where her next chapter began. By the time Natalie reached the hotel room, the shock had settled into something colder, something steadier. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in the same clothes she had worn to that cruel baby shower, and stared at the wall as if it might explain how the life she had known could disappear in a single afternoon. Ethan had called twice. Sophie had texted once. Neither message was an apology. Both were full of excuses, as if a few carefully chosen words could soften years of betrayal. Natalie didn't answer. Instead, she opened her laptop and began doing something she should have done long ago. She started trusting the facts more than the feelings she had been trained to excuse. The late nights. The sudden privacy. The way Sophie always seemed to be around just enough to know too much, but never enough to be questioned. The small lies that had once seemed harmless now lined up like warning signs on a dark road. She saw them clearly, and for the first time, she didn't blame herself for missing them. She had loved with an open heart. They had weaponized that trust. Her sister Claire came over that evening, bringing coffee and the kind of silence that says, "I'm here, you don't have to explain everything at once." When Natalie finally told her everything, Claire didn't gasp or lecture. She just listened, then said softly, "You are not crazy. You were betrayed by two people who knew exactly how to hide it." Those words mattered more than Natalie expected. Because betrayal has a way of making you doubt your own mind before it ever breaks your heart. The next morning, Natalie met with a lawyer. She moved carefully, like someone crossing a floor covered in broken glass. There would be paperwork, accounts, legal boundaries, and a future she had not yet imagined. But each step felt less like collapse and more like reclamation. Ethan had built a secret life in the shadows. Natalie would not spend hers there. And strangely, once she stopped trying to save what had already rotted, she began to breathe again. If you were Natalie, would you have confronted them that night, or would you have walked away in silence too? Either way, one thing becomes clear now. The real ending to this story was never about the affair. It was about what Natalie chose to do after it. And in the final chapter, that choice changes everything. By the time Natalie walked out of that house, the world she had built was already gone. But what followed was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her seeing clearly. In the quiet after the storm, she did something neither Ethan nor Sophie expected. She stopped begging for answers that would only wound her further, and she started asking better questions. How long had the lies been growing? Who had chosen comfort over honesty? And most importantly, Why had she ignored the small warnings that had been speaking to her for so long? The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. Every missed call, every sudden work trip, every awkward silence at dinner had been a red flag dressed up as normal life. Natalie had trusted the version of her marriage she wanted to believe in, and that made the betrayal even sharper. Still, she refused to let humiliation become her identity. She left with her dignity intact, her voice steady, her back straight, even as her hands shook. Sometimes strength is not loud. Sometimes it is simply refusing to collapse in front of the people who broke you. In the days that followed, Natalie found support in the places that had always been real. A sister who showed up without being asked. A friend who reminded her that betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. A therapist who helped her separate love from dependency and pain from punishment. Little by little, she began to reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried under years of compromise. She returned to work. She slept. She ate. She walked outside and noticed the sky again. Ethan tried to apologize, but apologies without accountability are just another form of selfishness. Sophie disappeared behind excuses and silence. Natalie no longer needed either of them to confess the full story, because she had already learned the most important lesson: clarity is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in heartbreak. And if there is one thing this story should leave behind, it is this: never ignore the red flags just because you love someone. Love should not require blindness. It should not cost you your peace. If Natalie's journey moved you, give this story a like, and tell me in the comments what warning sign you think people overlook most often. And if you want more stories about hidden betrayals, difficult truths, and the quiet strength it takes to start over, make sure to subscribe.